Today marks several international deadlines for Niger's military junta to restore the country's president to power. Canada is among Western nations ending financial assistance to Niger's government unless the coup leaders re-establish democracy. And a regional group called the Economic Community of West African States has drawn up plans for potential military action if President Mohamed Bazoum is not reinstated. Many residents of Niger's capital support efforts to overturn the country's military coup, but there are concerns that intervention could lead to a regional war. For a closer look, we're joined by Anne Fitzgerald. She's a professor of political science at Wilfrid Laurier University and the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs. She joins us from Waterloo, Ontario today. Good morning. I wanted to start by asking you, how significant is this decision by Canada to suspend all direct funding to Niger's government?
I think that the Canadian announcement follows that of a number of allies, such as France, Germany, and others. And this is a form of direct assistance, which is normally provided to legitimate constitutional governments. And in the absence of a legitimate democratic government acting in line with constitutional laws, there is no other actor to route these direct forms of international assistance to. So it's significant. Canada is standing with its allies. Canada has also recently stepped up its efforts on the African continent through its new African engagement strategy. And this is a clear demonstration that that strategy is underpinned by democratic norms and values.
Tell me, what kind of difference, if any, do you think it's going to make to the situation on the ground there?
Well, Niger is a country which already receives over $2 billion of international aid funding each year, and which is therefore very dependent on it. And over 4 million people in the country already require humanitarian assistance on an ongoing basis. So international aid funding directly given to governments is, particularly in Africa, is also used for such basic services like access to water, electricity, food, education. And if the crisis is left to continue, the war economy will start to set in, which will make these basic services inaccessible to many communities. And this will obviously be very harmful on the population. In terms of the government and how significant this will be to the military leadership that stepped in over the power grab, it's significant because the government can use that as a narrative to the people and blame much of the current country's problems, or the country's current problems, including the problems that set in from this instability, on the government, on the colonial legacies in the country, and hence rise up and ramp up the anti-colonial narrative. So it's very significant indeed.
Tell me, of course, Canada and other Western countries are reacting to the fact that Niger's democratically elected president has been deposed and removed. But there is another thing at stake here. Remind us about Niger's strategic importance in the region and the fight against terrorism.
Well, it's a very geostrategically important part of Africa and the world. That region is a very difficult neighborhood. Niger, as the largest country in West Africa, sits very prominently in that region and has, through the government, the first democratically elected government post-colonial times in Niger, has been relatively stable, albeit suffers from development and poverty challenges. It is host to over 1,000 French military forces, over 1,000 forces from the United States, which has 3 different bases across the country. But in that difficult neighborhood are non-state terrorist armed groups such as Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, the Islamic State. And there are also governments that have sustained their military leadership. That country also forms a critical link in a belt which spans across the African continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. And without that link being a democratic link, we could see a divide in across the continent. But this coup contagion, and this is the seventh coup in the Western and Central African region could also lead to divisions vertically as well as horizontally, and a real grab for Africa that we haven't seen in many years, but it's increasingly becoming a proxy battle space.
And tell me, West African states have given Niger until today to reinstate President Bazoum or face possible foreign intervention. How do you think this is going to play out?
I think we'll see a number of things play out from it. The first will likely, in my view, be an extension of the deadline. Not by much, though. They were only given a week to begin with. So I would say another 48 hours, another 36 hours. We may see the military leadership in Niger agree to some shuttle diplomacy without commitment. So not anything concerning a political settlement, but just agreement to set up humanitarian corridors and to see some aid and support to the country continue. Remember, this is a war amongst the people, so an insurgency is all about winning hearts and minds of the people. And that's what the government will be positioning itself to do, or the military leadership will be positioning itself to do, as well as the democratic forces. I think the other thing we could see is that ECOWAS does start mobilizing and deploying to forward operating bases around the country. It has the ability to deploy. It deployed to Liberia, it deployed to Gambia, where it still has a presence since 2017. And the military and political leadership across ECOWAS countries is quite resolute. There's an increasing view on the African country that the tolerance towards coups and military-led power grabs will be zero and should be zero in the future. So we'll also watch to see if any other countries like the northern African states step up to follow Algeria's announcement that it denounces any and will not support any military intervention. So we could also see splits occurring across the continent. We could see internal splits start fractionalizing within the military itself. Let's not forget that General Chiani, the leader of the coup, is the leader of the Presidential Guard and was not the leader of the armed forces. So it still remains questionable as to whether every element of the armed forces is following him. The last thing I would say is we will see a huge rise in disinformation and propaganda. Conflicts are now fought in the virtual space as well as on the ground. There will be control of the internet within the country and within some of the difficult countries that neighbor Niger, like Mali and Burkina Faso. And there will be attempts to win over the people's support, which will further prop up the current military leadership.